It was a chilly spring morning in a quiet suburban town in the United States. The kind of place where people usually left their doors unlocked and neighbors greeted one another by name. Yet, beneath the calm surface of this community, a storm was brewing. The county courthouse, normally reserved for the routine matters of property disputes and traffic violations, was about to witness one of the most unusual trials in its history. At the center of it all was a little girl, no older than 3 years. Her name was being withheld from the public to protect her identity, but everyone knew her as the toddler witness. She was small, her tiny legs barely able to climb into the oversized wooden chair in the courtroom. Her pigtails were neatly tied, and she clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit that looked like it had seen more comfortless nights than a child her age should ever have known. She wasn't supposed to be here, not in a room filled with stern faces, long robes, and an air so heavy it pressed down on even the most experienced lawyers. The case that had brought her here was complicated, sensitive, and full of dark details no one wanted a child to carry. Yet she was the only person who had seen enough to shed light on the truth. The stakes were high. The defense argued it was impossible, even absurd, to put a 3-year-old on the stand. The prosecution countered that sometimes the purest truth came from voices too small to lie. On the morning of the hearing, tension could be felt in every corner of the courthouse. Security officers kept their usual stern watch, though their eyes often softened when they glanced at the child holding her mother's hand. Lawyers whispered in corners, shuffling through thick files of evidence that suddenly seemed less powerful than the few words a toddler might utter. Reporters hovered outside, eager to capture what was quickly becoming a story of national interest. Inside, the courtroom was a study in contrasts. On one side sat the jury, 12 men and women fidgeting in their seats, their faces betraying a mix of curiosity and dread. Could they really trust the testimony of a child barely out of toddlerhood? On the other side sat the defense, their suits crisp, their expressions stiff, prepared to object to every syllable that might tumble out of her mouth. Between them sat the prosecution, visibly nervous yet holding on to hope that innocence could cut through the noise of legal jargon. Then there was the judge, a seasoned man with decades on the bench. He had presided over countless cases involving hardened criminals, bitter divorces, and lawsuits worth millions. Yet as he looked at the little girl fidgeting in her seat, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. His gavel had silenced grown men and women, but how could it command a toddler who barely understood the meaning of truth versus lies? The girl's parents sat directly behind her, their faces pale with anxiety. They knew the weight of what was being asked of their daughter. To them, she was just a child who still needed help tying her shoelaces and pronouncing certain words. Yet here she was, about to face a courtroom full of strangers who expected her to recall something that had shaken their family to its core. Her mother whispered words of comfort, though her voice trembled. Her father clasped his hands tightly, as if praying silently for strength neither he nor his daughter had ever needed so desperately before. As the bailiff called the court to order, the sound of the gavel echoed sharply, startling the little girl. She squeezed her stuffed rabbit tighter and looked around with wide, frightened eyes. The room was filled with an intimidating silence, broken only by the shuffle of papers and the occasional cough. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and tension. The prosecutor approached slowly, almost cautiously, as though afraid of breaking something fragile. He crouched down to the child's level, offering a gentle smile that felt foreign in the stern environment. "Do you know why you're here today?" he asked softly, his voice more suited to bedtime stories than legal proceedings. The girl shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressing together as though she was hiding words she couldn't quite find. She looked back at her mother, who gave an encouraging nod, and then down at her stuffed toy. For a long moment, the entire room held its breath, waiting to see if she would speak. But she didn't. She tucked her face against the rabbit's woolen fur and shook her head. Murmurs spread across the courtroom. The defense attorney smirked slightly, certain that this was proof of what they had argued all along: too young, too unreliable, too scared. But the prosecution didn't back down. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, standing again, "we believe the child can testify, but she may need additional support. She cannot be expected to face this environment alone." The judge frowned, glancing at the defense, who immediately stood to object. "Your Honor, this is already unprecedented. A toddler's testimony is highly questionable. Adding unnecessary accommodations will only taint the integrity of these proceedings." But the prosecutor pressed on. "She already has a support system," he said, gesturing toward the door. "A trained police dog. He has been working with her during therapy sessions, helping her feel safe enough to speak. If allowed inside, he may provide the comfort she needs." The courtroom erupted in whispers. A dog? In court? It sounded absurd, even laughable to some. But for those who had seen the little girl with her canine companion, it made perfect sense. The judge tapped his gavel for silence, his expression thoughtful. "I will allow it," he said finally, to the surprise of many. "If the child feels safer with the dog, then the dog may enter." At that moment, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. What had begun as a tense, almost hopeless situation now carried the faintest glimmer of hope. For the first time that morning, the little girl lifted her head. Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles, as if she understood that her friend was coming. The defense attorney muttered under his breath, but even he could see the tide beginning to turn. Everyone leaned forward in anticipation, waiting to see what would happen next. The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Heavy footsteps padded against the polished wood floor, each one announcing the arrival of someone or something that could change the course of the trial. The little girl's eyes lit up. She set her stuffed rabbit aside and sat a little taller, ready at last to face the room. And with that, the story of the youngest witness in the courtroom's history truly began. The courtroom was not designed for children. Its heavy wooden benches, towering judges' stand, and shelves of thick law books spoke the language of adults, serious, formal, unyielding. To a 3-year-old girl, it was an alien world. She sat at the front, her little legs swinging off the edge of the oversized chair, her eyes darting nervously from the unfamiliar faces around her. She was far from a playground, far from the world she knew, and everyone could see how out of place she seemed. The judge watched her carefully from his elevated seat. Though he had presided over countless trials, he could not recall ever having such a young witness. He had read about cases where children were brought in to testify, but never one this young. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses, and felt the weight of responsibility press down. Could justice truly rely on the words of someone so small, someone who still barely understood the difference between make-believe and reality? The prosecution team was acutely aware of the challenge before them. They had argued passionately that the child should be heard, that her voice mattered more than anyone else's in the case. But now, looking at her timid face and trembling hands, even they felt a wave of doubt. What if she refused to speak at all? What if her fear silenced her in front of the jury? The defense attorneys, on the other hand, seemed confident. They whispered among themselves, their lips curling into thin smiles. To them, the child's silence or confusion would work perfectly. They didn't need to disprove her words if she never spoke them clearly in the first place. All they had to do was wait, let her nervousness take over, and watch the prosecution's case collapse. Her parents sat a few feet away, torn between pride and terror. They had been told from the beginning that involving their daughter would not be easy, that it might even be traumatizing. Yet they had also been told that her voice was essential. Without her, justice might slip away. Her mother's hands clenched tightly in her lap, as if she could somehow will courage into her daughter. Her father's gaze never wavered from her small figure, silently cheering her on. The girl herself remained quiet, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly against her chest. Her wide eyes darted between the lawyers and the jury, the judge and the rows of strangers staring at her. The room was too big, too cold, too frightening. She was 3 years old, and nothing about this place felt safe. The prosecutor rose slowly, aware of the delicate situation. He crouched slightly to lower himself to her level. "Hi there," he said gently, his voice softer than it had been all morning. "Do you remember me?" The girl gave a tiny nod, though she didn't speak. "That's good," the prosecutor continued, smiling warmly. "I just want you to tell us a little bit about what happened, okay? You don't have to be scared." But the reassurance wasn't enough. The little girl buried her face against the rabbit again, shaking her head. A wave of disappointment rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorneys exchanged satisfied glances. The judge leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. This wasn't working. The child wasn't going to open up in this environment. For a moment, he considered calling for a recess, but then he remembered the earlier discussion about her therapy sessions. The prosecutor had mentioned something unusual, something about a police dog. "Counselor," the judge said, interrupting, "I recall you mentioned the child had a companion. A canine, if I'm not mistaken?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied quickly, seizing the opportunity. "She has been working with a trained police dog. He has provided comfort during therapy and helped her find her voice. If permitted, he could accompany her here." The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a courtroom, not a kennel. Bringing in an animal sets a dangerous precedent and risks turning this trial into a spectacle." The judge raised a hand, silencing the objections. "I will allow it," he said firmly after a moment's thought. "If the presence of this animal can help the witness testify, then it is necessary. The integrity of the testimony depends not on the setting, but on the truth it reveals." The decision sent a ripple of murmurs through the room. The jurors leaned forward, intrigued. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Even the little girl seemed to stir at the mention of her companion. For the first time all morning, her expression changed. She peeked up from behind her stuffed rabbit, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. Her mother reached forward, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "He's coming," she whispered gently. "Your friend is coming." The girl's eyes brightened at those words. She shifted in her chair, her small body straightening as though she already felt stronger. Her tiny hand relaxed its grip on the rabbit just a little. Meanwhile, the bailiff moved toward the door. The room fell into a hush, all eyes turning to the entrance. The defense attorney shook his head in frustration, muttering under his breath, but no one paid him much attention. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. A moment later, the door creaked open. The sound of steady, deliberate footsteps echoed across the polished wooden floor. Heavy, calm, measured, a kind of footsteps that belonged to someone or something confident and unafraid. Every head turned, and the child's eyes lit up in recognition. She leaned forward, nearly standing, her fear momentarily forgotten. She no longer seemed like a frightened toddler in an intimidating courtroom. She looked like a child about to be reunited with her best friend. What entered that courtroom was more than just a dog. It was hope, courage, and the possibility of truth finding its way through fear. The little girl's lips parted into a smile. Her stuffed rabbit slipped to the floor, forgotten. She was ready now, not because of the lawyers, not because of the judge, but because her silent protector had arrived. And with his entrance, the story was about to take a turn that no one in the courtroom would ever forget. The hush that fell over the courtroom was unlike anything the building had ever held. It wasn't the forced silence of a judge's gavel or the tense quiet before a verdict. It was something deeper, anticipation, curiosity, a collective breath that dozens of strangers unknowingly held at once. All eyes fixed on the door as the steady rhythm of paws echoed against the polished wooden floor dot. Then he appeared. The police dog was a magnificent German shepherd, his coat a mix of sable brown and black, glistening under the harsh courtroom lights. His stride was calm, purposeful, unhurried, every movement radiating confidence and composure. At his side walked his handler, an officer in uniform, but it was clear from the start who commanded the attention of the room. The jurors leaned forward instinctively. Reporters craned their necks for a better view. Even the defense attorneys, who had scoffed at the idea moments before, could not disguise their surprise at the animal's commanding presence. But the most important reaction came from the smallest person in the room. The little girl's face transformed the instant she saw him. Her wide, fearful eyes lit up, and her tiny body leaned forward so quickly she nearly toppled from her chair. "Buddy," she whispered in delight, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom like the ringing of a bell. She clapped her hands together, the stuffed rabbit slipping unnoticed to the floor. For the first time all day, fear melted from her features, replaced by joy so pure it seemed to warm the entire room. The dog's ears perked at her voice. His gaze locked onto her instantly, steady and unblinking, as though he had entered the room for her and her alone. Without hesitation, a handler guided him forward, and the dog padded across the courtroom floor with the unhurried certainty of someone who belonged. The girl slid from her chair and ran the few steps to meet him. Gasps rippled through the audience, but no one stopped her. In that moment, the formal decorum of the courtroom didn't matter. What mattered was the reunion. She threw her tiny arms around the dog's thick neck and buried her face in his fur. The animal didn't flinch, didn't move, except for the slow wag of his tail. He simply stood tall, steady, a fortress of calm for the fragile child clinging to him. It was a scene no one had expected. Hardened lawyers felt their throats tighten. The judge, known for his stern demeanor, allowed the faintest of smiles to cross his lips. Even the skeptical defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, glancing away as though embarrassed to witness such raw innocence. "Order," the judge finally said, though his voice was softer than usual, almost indulgent. The gavel tapped once, more a reminder than a command. "Please, return to your seat, young lady. Buddy may sit with you." The girl obeyed, tugging gently at the dog's collar. The officer guided him to her side, and soon the child was back in her chair, her small hand gripping the thick fur at his neck. The transformation was astonishing. The child who had moments ago hidden behind a stuffed toy now sat taller, her shoulders straighter, her fear seemingly dissolved by the presence of her companion. The prosecution wasted no time. Seizing the opportunity, the lawyer approached once more, careful not to rush. "Do you feel better now?" he asked softly. The little girl nodded, her hand still resting firmly on Buddy's back. "He makes me safe," she said, her tiny voice carrying across the courtroom with unexpected clarity. Those simple words struck the room like a chord. The jury shifted, many of them visibly moved. The defense attorney scribbled furiously in his notes, though it was clear no amount of legal maneuvering could erase the image unfolding before them. The prosecutor smiled. "That's wonderful. Can you tell Buddy what happened?" "You don't have to talk to me, just talk to him." For a moment, the girl tilted her head, considering. Then she leaned closer to Buddy, her lips brushing his ear. "He was mean," she whispered, her small voice trembling but audible in the otherwise silent room. "He scared me, but Buddy was there. Buddy made me brave." The dog didn't move. He simply sat, ears forward, eyes fixed, his stillness a form of devotion that made it seem as though he truly understood. The girl's grip tightened as she whispered again, her words growing louder. I remember. He was there that night. He hurt Mommy. I saw him. A collective gasp spread through the courtroom. No one interrupted. No one dared. It wasn't a formal testimony, not in the way adults delivered facts and details, but it was truth. Simple, unfiltered, and undeniably powerful. The defense attorney finally rose. Objection. He barked, his voice louder than intended. This is highly irregular. She isn't addressing the court. She's talking to a dog. The judge raised an eyebrow, his gavel tapping once. Overruled, he said firmly. The court will accept the child's testimony in this manner. The truth is being spoken, and it is clear the presence of the dog enables her to do so. We will not silence her. The defense attorney sank back into his chair, his jaw clenched. Meanwhile, the little girl continued to speak, her voice steadying with each sentence. Buddy knows, she said softly. He was there when I told the nice lady at the office. He always listens. He makes me brave when I'm scared. She pressed her face into his fur, drawing strength from the steady rise and fall of his breath. In that moment, the jury wasn't just hearing the words of a child. They were witnessing something profound, the bridge between innocence and justice, built by loyalty, trust, and the silent support of a dog who asked for nothing in return. As the day wore on, more questions were asked. The girl answered them, always through Buddy, her words directed to him, but heard by all. Each response carried the ring of honesty, wrapped in the simplicity of a child's perspective. There were no embellishments, no manipulations, just the unvarnished truth. By the time court adjourned that afternoon, the case had taken a dramatic turn. What had begun as a risky gamble placing a toddler on the stand had become the prosecution's greatest strength, and as the little girl was led out of the courtroom, her tiny hand resting proudly on Buddy's back, everyone knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The case was no longer about whether a child could testify. It was about how far courage, innocence, and the silent loyalty of a dog could carry the weight of truth. The courtroom had been silent many times before. During verdicts, during cross-examinations, during tense arguments between lawyers, but never like this. This silence was different. It wasn't born of formality or order. It was the kind of silence that stretched taut, like a wire pulled to its limit, because everyone inside knew they were watching something delicate and rare unfold. The little girl sat in her chair, Buddy the police dog by her side, her tiny fingers threaded through his thick fur. The prosecution had asked their first question, careful, gentle. Yet instead of answering the lawyer, the child leaned down toward Buddy. At first, it seemed like shyness, the way children sometimes whisper secrets into the ears of their stuffed toys. But then her lips moved, and though her voice was small, the entire courtroom leaned forward to catch it. He was mean, she whispered, her forehead pressed against Buddy's ear. He scared me. The words were simple, childlike, but they carried the weight of truth, unpolished and unguarded. The dog did not move. His stillness was remarkable, almost reverent. He simply sat, ears tilted slightly toward her, as though he were not only hearing her words but absorbing them, holding them safe. The prosecutor didn't interrupt. He didn't repeat the question or ask her to speak louder. He knew that silence was their ally now. The entire room strained to hear her fragile words. The girl continued, her small voice trembling at first, but slowly growing steadier. He came into our house, she said softly, her eyes fixed on Buddy. He hurt Mommy. I saw him. I was hiding, but I saw. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney shot to his feet, his objection echoing through the chamber. Your Honor, this is hearsay, delivered through a dog. This is outrageous. She isn't testifying to this court. She's engaging in play. The judge's gavel cracked against the wood, silencing the room. His gaze fixed on the defense attorney. Overruled, he said, his voice steady. The child is speaking truth in the only way she is capable. This court will hear her. The defense attorney dropped back into his seat, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he gripped his pen. But it was clear to everyone that his interruption had only made things worse. The jury glared in his direction, their sympathy firmly with the child, who sat trembling but brave beside her companion. The little girl looked briefly, startled by the raised voices, but Buddy's steady presence anchored her. She pressed her face against his fur, inhaling deeply as though drawing courage from the familiar scent of safety. Then, in a voice just a little louder, she added, "Buddy knows. I told him when I was scared. He always listens." The prosecutor nodded gently. "That's very good," he said softly, careful not to intrude too much. "Can you keep telling Buddy what you saw?" The girl hesitated, her fingers twisting into Buddy's coat. For a moment, she seemed to retreat inward, but then she whispered again. "He had a big voice. He yelled. He pushed Mommy. Mommy cried." Her eyes flicked up, briefly meeting the prosecutor's, then darted back to Buddy. "I didn't like it. I hid." The courtroom was spellbound. The details were not precise in the way adult testimony often was. There were no times, no dates, no measured descriptions. But the truth was there, woven through the simplicity of her words. What she lacked in detail, she more than made up for in authenticity. There was no doubt she was remembering, not inventing. Some jurors wiped at their eyes. Others sat stiffly, their expressions tight with contained emotion. The judge leaned forward slightly, his normally impassive face softened by the undeniable humanity of what he was hearing. The defense attorney tried once more, rising with forced calm. "Your Honor, with respect, this cannot be allowed. The child is clearly being coached. She isn't speaking to the court, she is pretending to talk to the animal." The judge's gavel came down sharply. "Enough. This court will not strip a child of her voice, simply because it is delivered in an unconventional manner. Proceed." Defeated for the moment, the defense attorney sat back down, his lips pressed into a thin line. The prosecutor gave the child a reassuring nod, but didn't push her with more questions. Instead, he let her speak in her own way, to Buddy. And she did. Slowly, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. She spoke of fear, of hiding, of hearing her mother's cries. She spoke of how Buddy, later, had been the only one she could tell without feeling afraid. "Buddy didn't tell me to be quiet," she said in her small, clear voice. "He just listened. He made me feel like I wasn't alone. That's why I can tell him now." In that moment, the entire courtroom understood what was happening. The police dog wasn't just a comfort animal. He was a bridge away for a child, too young to face the intimidating machinery of the justice system to still deliver the truth. The defense attorneys scribbled furiously, but it was clear they were losing ground. The jurors' hearts had already been won over, and even the seasoned judge seemed deeply affected. As the questioning wound down, the girl leaned one final time into Buddy's ear. "It's okay now," she whispered. "I told you. I was brave." The dog, silent and steadfast, blinked slowly and remained still, as though honoring her courage. When the judge finally called for a recess, the courtroom exhaled as one. People blinked, wiped their eyes, shifted in their seats, trying to shake off the intensity of what they had just witnessed. But no one would ever forget it. The testimony of a 3-year-old, spoken not to the lawyers or the court, but to a loyal police dog, had just shifted the course of the trial. And everyone in that room knew they had been part of something extraordinary, something that transcended legal procedure, something that proved that truth could find its voice in the most unexpected ways. The courtroom, still heavy with the echoes of the little girl's testimony, felt transformed. Something intangible had shifted in those walls. What had started as just another trial, with its formalities and motions and objections, now carried the weight of raw humanity. Every person present understood they had witnessed a moment that was bigger than legal arguments. It was truth spoken in its purest, most unfiltered form. Reporters sat frozen in the gallery, their notebooks untouched. Even they had forgotten their duty for a moment, lost in the sight of a child leaning into a dog's ear to reveal the horrors she had witnessed. The bailiffs, usually stoic, exchanged glances that betrayed their own quiet awe, but not everyone was moved. At the defense table, tension burned hot. The accused, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetually clenched jaw, shifted in his chair, his eyes darting toward the child and then away again. For the first time since the trial began, cracks appeared in his composure. He tapped his foot against the floor, jaw grinding as if the words of a toddler delivered through a dog were more dangerous than any mountain of evidence. The defense attorney leaned close to him, whispering harshly. His pen scribbled notes in a furious hand, underlining phrases and circling others. His entire strategy was unraveling, and he knew it. He had built his defense on discrediting adult witnesses, poking holes in timelines and suggesting reasonable doubt. But how could one dismantle the unpolished honesty of a child who had no motive, no agenda, only memory and fear? As the court recessed, whispers filled the air. Jurors exchanged glances, their faces etched with empathy. One woman dabbed at her eyes, while a man on the end of the row sat stiffly, his jaw tight, as though willing himself not to break down. In a quiet corner near the front, the child's mother sat clutching a tissue, tears streaming unchecked down her cheeks. She had not been able to comfort her daughter when the stand courtroom rules forbade it, but she silently mouthed words of love and pride every time their eyes met. She had never been prouder of her little girl, though the ache of what her daughter had endured twisted painfully inside her. During the recess, the prosecutor gathered his team. "This changes everything," he whispered, his voice carrying both excitement and caution. "The jury doesn't just believe her, they felt her. They saw her courage. They'll carry that into deliberations." One of his colleagues nodded. "The defense can scream about hearsay all they want, but you can't erase the image of that child with the dog. It's seared into their minds." Meanwhile, the defense attorney tried to rally. He paced the hallway, muttering under his breath, already planning his cross-examination. He needed to dismantle this testimony, redirect attention, plant seeds of doubt. But deep down, he feared it might already be too late. When court resumed, the air was charged in, the jury leaning forward with anticipation. The defense wasted no time. He rose from his chair, buttoning his jacket with deliberate precision, and approached the child. His smile was rehearsed, his tone smooth, but the sharpness beneath it was unmistakable. "You've been very brave today," he began, his words coated with false warmth. "But I need to ask you some questions. Is that okay?" The little girl clutched Buddy's fur tighter, her wide eyes watching the man carefully. The dog's steady presence grounded her, and after a moment, she gave a tiny nod. The attorney crouched slightly, trying to appear less intimidating. "Now, sweetheart, you said some things to Buddy earlier. But sometimes, when we're little, we imagine things, don't we? Like monsters under the bed?" The courtroom tensed. The prosecutor was on his feet instantly. "Objection, Your Honor, condescending and leading." "Sustained," the judge said firmly. "Rephrase, counselor." The attorney's jaw tightened, but he forced his smile to remain. "Of course. Let me ask you this. Did anyone tell you what to say today?" The child's head tilted slightly, confusion flickering across her face. Then she shook her head and buried her face in Buddy's ear again. "Buddy told me to be brave. That's all." The courtroom erupted in soft laughter, quickly hushed by the judge's gavel. But the damage to the defense was immediate. The child's innocence cut through his calculated question like a blade. Undeterred, he pressed on. Are you sure you remember what you saw? Sometimes memories get mixed up. Sometimes dreams feel real. The little girl pulled back from Buddy just enough to whisper, her voice trembling but clear. I know it was real. Because I was scared. And Mommy cried. Dreams don't make you cry like that. Gasps rippled again through the gallery. Even the judge's stern face softened. The defense attorney faltered, his carefully constructed strategy collapsing in the face of truth spoken so plainly. He tried one last time, desperation creeping into his tone. Sweetheart, can you tell me how do you know it was this man? He pointed toward the defendant. The little girl's gaze shifted, her small body trembling. For a moment, it seemed she might retreat, but Buddy shifted subtly, his body pressing gently against hers, anchoring her once more. She lifted her chin, eyes glistening with tears, and pointed her tiny finger straight at the man seated at the defense table. It was him, she whispered, her voice barely audible, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. I saw him hurt, Mommy. The room erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors' faces hardened, and the accused's composure finally cracked. His face twisted with anger, and he slammed his palm against the table. She's lying. He barked, his voice echoing. The judge's gavel thundered. Order, order in this court. But the damage was done. The defendant's outburst had revealed his temper for all to see, and the child's testimony, paired with her innocent courage, had pierced the heart of the trial dot as the judge called for a second recess to regain order. The entire courtroom buzzed with the realization that something irreversible had happened. The scales of justice had tipped, and they all knew in which direction. The bravery of a 3-year-old child and the silent strength of a loyal police dog had just shaken the foundations of a trial and perhaps sealed its outcome. The second recess was more chaotic than the first. The child's pointed finger and quiet words, it was him, hung heavy in the minds of everyone who had heard them. Jurors filed out of the box, whispering urgently to one another, despite the bailiff's reminders to remain silent. Reporters bolted toward the lobby, already dictating frantic notes into their recorders, while spectators buzzed in hushed conversations about what they had just seen. The courthouse corridors thrummed with energy. Strangers shook their heads in disbelief. Lawyers from other cases stopped mid-stride to ask what had happened, and clerks huddled together, recounting the little girl's testimony as if it were folklore being passed on in real time. For many, it was not just legal history being made. It was a story of courage that transcended the walls of the courtroom. Inside the recess room reserved for the prosecution, tension gave way to cautious optimism. The lead prosecutor leaned against the table, arms crossed, but his eyes gleamed with something rare. Hope. We've got him, he murmured. One of his junior attorneys nodded. The jury believes her. You could feel it. But another colleague raised a note of caution. We can't underestimate the defense. He's cornered, yes, but that makes him dangerous. He'll find some angle to twist this, maybe claim the child was influenced, maybe attack her credibility. The prosecutor straightened, his jaw tightening. Then we make sure her words stand on their own. She didn't sound rehearsed. She didn't sound coached. She sounded real. And that's more powerful than anything they can throw at us. In another chamber, the defense team was in disarray. The accused sat with his arms crossed, his face flushed with fury. She's 3 years old. He snapped. 3. You're letting a baby decide my future? His attorney rubbed his temples. You don't understand. It's not just what she said, it's how she said it. The jury isn't just hearing her. They're feeling her. And then you. He stopped, choosing his words carefully. You lost your temper. In front of them. That outburst nearly sealed the deal for the prosecution. The defendant slammed his fist against the table. She's lying. They'll see it. But deep down, He knew the tide had turned. His lawyer did too. The weight of the child's testimony, paired with the defendant's visible anger, had tilted the scales against them. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation as the judge re-entered. His expression was measured, but the faint weariness in his eyes betrayed that even he felt the enormity of what was happening. He raised his gavel once more, restoring order. "We will proceed," he said firmly. "The defense may call its next witness." The defense attorney hesitated. His plan to dismantle the child's testimony had failed spectacularly, leaving his strategy in tatters. But he pressed forward, calling character witnesses, attempting to paint his client as a man of integrity, a provider, someone incapable of violence. Yet the words rang hollow. Every juror's mind returned again and again to the image of the trembling child whispering into the ear of a police dog. No carefully crafted testimony could erase it. The prosecutor's cross-examinations cut deep. "Are you aware," he asked one character witness, "that the defendant has a prior history of violent outbursts?" Objections flew, but the truth kept slipping through. Each answer chipped away at the fragile facade the defense was building. Meanwhile, the little girl waited in a private room with Buddy, her legs swinging off the edge of a chair too big for her small frame. Court staff had brought her juice and crackers, but she barely touched them. She stroked Buddy's fur, humming softly under her breath, her innocence a stark contrast to the storm raging in the courtroom. When her mother was finally allowed in, she rushed to her daughter's side, kneeling to wrap her arms around her. "You were so brave," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. So brave." The girl smiled sleepily, pressing her cheek against Buddy's head. "I wasn't scared, 'cause Buddy was here," she said simply. For the jurors, the ripple effect of that testimony continued long after they returned to their seats. During breaks, they sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. They weren't allowed to discuss the case outside deliberations, but the weight of the child's words was evident in their expressions. One juror, a father himself, couldn't stop picturing his own daughter at that age, how small her hands had been, how fragile her voice sounded when she cried. Another juror, who had worked as a teacher, thought of all the children she had protected, and the way children's truths often slipped out in ways adults underestimated. The public, too, was swept up in the ripple. News outlets carried the story within hours. 3-year-old testifies through police dog. Social media lit up with posts praising the child's courage. Hashtags trended. Artists sketched portraits of a little girl whispering to a dog. And advocates for child victims hailed it as a watershed moment in courtroom history. But inside the trial, the fight was far from over. The defense attorney launched every maneuver he could think of, motions to strike testimony, accusations of prosecutorial misconduct, claims that the child had been emotionally manipulated. Each was met with firm resistance from the prosecution and steady rulings from the judge. Still, the tension was palpable. The outcome seemed clear, but trials are living things, unpredictable until the final gavel falls. The defense clung to hope, thin as it was, that something might shift, some technicality might crack the prosecution's case. Yet the heart of the trial remained the same. A child had spoken the truth in her own way. And once spoken, truth has a way of echoing, reverberating far beyond the moment it is first uttered. As the day drew to a close, the judge dismissed the jury for the evening. They filed out slowly, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on them. The prosecutor gathered his papers with quiet determination, while the defense attorney's shoulders sagged under the burden of a losing battle. And in that private room, far from the courtroom's tension, a little girl curled up beside Buddy, finally drifting into the deep, peaceful sleep only a child can manage. The storm raged on outside, but within that small circle of fur and innocence, there was calm. Everyone knew the end was approaching. The question was not if the truth would prevail, but how long it would take for the system to catch up to what the heart already knew. The day's proceedings ended with the courtroom, wrapped in tension so thick it was almost suffocating. When the judge dismissed everyone for the evening, the jurors filed out one by one, each carrying the invisible weight of what they had heard. Their faces revealed little professionally trained stoicism, demanded it, but there was a heaviness in their steps that betrayed the burden resting on their shoulders. Outside, the courthouse steps were swarmed by reporters. Microphones and cameras thrust forward, questions fired rapid as bullets. Do you think the jury believed the child? Is this a turning point for courtroom testimony? Can a 3-year-old's words really seal a conviction? The attorneys ignored them all, pushing through the crowd with tight expressions. The prosecutor gave no sound bite. The defense attorney muttered only, "The case isn't over yet." But in the quiet corners of the courthouse, the most important story wasn't happening in front of cameras. It was unfolding in the private waiting room, where the little girl lay fast asleep, curled against Buddy's warm body. Her small hand was still tangled in his fur, as though even in her dreams she needed to feel his steady presence. Her mother sat beside them, watching her daughter's peaceful face, her heart torn between relief and sorrow. "She's too young to have gone through all of this," the mother whispered to a social worker sitting nearby. "But she's stronger than I ever imagined. Stronger than me." The social worker smiled gently. Children often are. And today, she didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for you too. The jury heard her. They won't forget. Across town, the jury gathered in their hotel rooms. Court rules kept them sequestered, cut off from television, phones, and the tidal wave of public opinion that had erupted outside. But even in isolation, the weight of their duty pressed down. Some tried to distract themselves with books or conversation. Others sat staring into space, replaying the little girl's trembling voice in their minds. For one juror, a father of 3, the testimony hit like a hammer. He kept seeing his youngest daughter's face whenever the child spoke. He thought of her tiny hands clutching her favorite stuffed bear, the way she whispered secrets into its ear when she was scared. And he absolutely knew, that children didn't invent fear like that. They remembered it. Another juror, an older woman with decades of teaching behind her, couldn't stop thinking about the way the child pointed at the defendant. There had been no hesitation, no confusion, only truth. She had seen countless children try to explain their feelings, their fears, their truths. This was no game of pretend. This was memory. Meanwhile, the accused paced his cell like a caged animal. His temper boiled over again and again, fists slamming against the wall, curses hurled at no one in particular. A 3-year-old. They'll throw me in prison because of a 3-year-old. His voice carried down the corridors, echoing off concrete walls. Guards exchanged weary looks. They had seen men fall apart before sentencing, but rarely this early. His attorney visited, papers clutched in one hand, his face lined with exhaustion. "You need to calm down," he snapped. "Every outburst makes you look worse. Tomorrow, I'll deliver closing arguments. I'll remind them about reasonable doubt, about the dangers of convicting based on a child's perspective. But if you keep this up, if you lose control again, we'll have nothing left," the defendant sneered. "They're already against me. You saw their faces. They believe her. They all believe her." The attorney had no answer. He knew it was true. Back in the prosecutor's office, preparations for the next day were underway. The team worked late, refining closing statements, highlighting the strongest points of the case. But again and again, their notes circled back to one simple moment. The little girl whispering into Buddy's ear. No flowery rhetoric, no mountain of evidence, no passionate speech could compete with that dot. The lead prosecutor leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "We don't need to overcomplicate it tomorrow," he said quietly. We just need to remind the jury of what they already know in their hearts. She told the truth, and Buddy made her brave enough to say it. As night fell over the city, the courthouse loomed dark and silent against the skyline. Inside its walls, the echoes of the day lingered, gasps, whispers, the sharp crack of the judge's gavel. But beyond those walls, the story had taken on a life of its own. News broadcasts ran continuous coverage. Headlines blared across the country. Social media erupted with messages of support, with strangers calling the little girl a hero. Some critics, of course, raised doubts. Legal analysts questioned whether such testimony should be admissible, whether it blurred the line between evidence and emotion. But for every skeptic, a dozen voices rose in defense of the child's courage. In her small bed, miles from the courthouse, the little girl stirred in her sleep. Buddy lay on the floor beside her, his eyes half closed but alert, ears twitching at every sound. He was her guardian now, both in the courtroom and beyond. She murmured softly in her dreams, pressing her tiny hand against his fur, and he shifted closer, as if to say, "You're safe. I'm here." The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the trial's next act. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, the jury's deliberations, and a long-awaited verdict. But tonight was for reflection, for grappling with what had already been revealed, for understanding the ripple effect of truth spoken in the gentlest of voices. For some, it was the longest night of their lives. For others, it was the first night they truly believed justice might be possible. And in the silence that stretched across those hours, everyone knew, when the gavel fell again, nothing would ever be the same. Morning came heavy with anticipation. By the time the sun rose over the courthouse, crowds had already gathered on the steps. Reporters set up their cameras, anchors rehearsed their lines, and passers-by paused to watch history in the making. The trial that had begun as just another entry on the docket had grown into a national story, and now all eyes were fixed on its conclusion. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The judge took his seat, gavel in hand, his face carved into its usual mask of impartiality. The jury filed in, silent and solemn, their expressions unreadable. They had listened to every word, watched every detail, and now their duty was nearly done. The defendant sat at the table, shoulders squared, but eyes restless. He had tried to compose himself overnight, but the twitch of his jaw and the tapping of his foot betrayed the storm brewing inside him. His attorney whispered last-minute reminders, urging calm, urging focus. But calm was a foreign language to him now. At the prosecution table, the lead attorney rested his hands on his notes, but barely glanced at them. He knew the heart of his case had already been spoken, not by him, but by a child too young to understand the weight of her courage. Today was about honoring that truth, not embellishing it. The little girl was not present for this part. After her testimony, the judge had granted the family's request to shield her from the harsher procedures of the trial. Instead, she sat at home with Buddy by her side, coloring with crayons while the world debated her words. She didn't know the intricacies of legal proceedings or what verdict meant, but she knew one thing. She had been brave, and Buddy had listened. The judge nodded for the prosecution to begin. The lead attorney rose slowly, his voice calm but deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "you have heard the evidence. You have seen the witnesses. But above all, you have heard the truth from the one voice that mattered most. A voice too young to lie, too pure to scheme, too small to carry anything but honesty. That voice spoke through fear, through trembling, and through the steady presence of a police dog who gave her the courage to say what needed to be said. You must ask yourselves, why would a child, only 3 years old, point to that man? Why would she tremble? Why would she cry? Why would she whisper into her dog's ear, unless it were the truth? There is no coaching strong enough, no influence powerful enough to manufacture what you saw. That was truth in its rawest form. And truth demands justice. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, then delivered his final plea. Do not let her courage be in vain. Deliver the verdict she deserves. The defense attorney rose next, his tone sharper, his words faster, almost desperate. He spoke of reasonable doubt, of the unreliability of child memory, of the dangers of emotion overriding fact. He painted the prosecution's case as fragile, hinging entirely on the words of a toddler too young to comprehend. But his arguments rang hollow. The jury's eyes stayed fixed, their faces unmoved. The contrast between his cold logic and the child's unshakable innocence was stark, and every word only seemed to widen the gap. Finally, the judge gave his instructions, precise and deliberate, reminding the jury of their duty to weigh all evidence carefully. Then they filed out, disappearing behind the closed door of the deliberation room. Hours passed. The courtroom remained filled with restless energy. Spectators shifted in their seats, reporters scribbled predictions, and attorneys pretended to review their notes, though their minds were far away. Every tick of the clock seemed amplified, every minute stretched into eternity. Then, at last, the bailiff's voice broke the tension. The jury has reached a verdict. The room stilled instantly. Everyone rose as the jury filed back in, their faces still unreadable. The foreperson clutched a folded paper in trembling hands. The judge accepted it, his eyes scanning briefly before handing it back. In the matter of the state versus the defendant, the foreperson began, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The word hung in the air like thunder. For a moment, silence reigned. Then it broke gasps, cries, muffled sobs. Reporters scrambled to record, pens flying, cameras flashing. The defendant's face twisted, fury erupting as he slammed his fists against the table. This is a joke. You can't do this to me. He roared, but bailiffs were already on him, restraining him as the judge banged his gavel again and again. Order! Order in the court. But the verdict had already spoken louder than any gavel dot at home. The child's mother received the call. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she hugged her daughter close. She whispered the words gently. It's over, baby. You did it. We're safe now. The little girl tilted her head, not fully understanding, but smiled anyway. Buddy helped, she said simply, stroking the dog's fur. News of the verdict spread quickly, igniting waves of reaction across the country. Commentators hailed the courage of a 3-year-old as the linchpin of justice. Legal scholars debated the precedent. Advocates for victims celebrated a breakthrough moment, proof that even the smallest voices could echo loudly in the halls of justice. In the weeks that followed, the story refused to fade. Portraits of the child and Buddy appeared on magazine covers. Editorials called it the trial that changed everything. Legislators began discussing reforms to better accommodate child witnesses, inspired by the bravery of one little girl and the silent strength of one loyal dog. But for those at the heart of it, the legacy was simpler, more personal. The mother found peace in her daughter's smile again, no longer shadowed by fear. The prosecutor carried the case in his memory as a reminder of why he fought for truth, no matter how small the voice that carried it. And Buddy, ever steady, continued his work, but always with the mark of having been more than a dog. He had been the bridge that allowed justice to be spoken. As for the little girl, life slowly returned to normal. She went back to playing with dolls, drawing with crayons, laughing at cartoons. The courtroom faded into a story she would not fully understand until she was older. But even then, she would remember one thing clearly: the day she was brave, and the day Buddy listened. And for everyone who had witnessed it, one truth remained undeniable. Sometimes, the smallest voice spoken through the gentlest of whispers, carries the greatest power of all.